Okay, so this is the GitHub repo of the project. And first of all, let's give credit where credit is due. So the main graphics or visuals for this course comes from this 32 Rogues asset pack by Seth. You take a look at this beautiful pixel art. I think it looks crisp. I instantly fell in love with it. So I figured we can use this for the whole course. So thanks, Seth, for making this cool asset pack. Then I also used Kenny's cursor pixel pack to sort of substitute the default cursor with a nicer looking one. And there are also a bunch of cool people who made the sound effects, the fonts, and the music we'll be using in the course. So make sure to check them out and show them some love. Now, what about this repository? Again, this will be a bit different from what we did with the State Aspire course, in a sense that I will provide a different branch for each individual video. So if you're stuck at any point or you can't find a typo in your code, you can always download the code that's required to follow along. So click on the branches and you'll see that right now we only have a main branch and the starter project as I'm recording the first video. But by the time I upload this, there will be a new branch for episode 1, so you can follow along from anywhere in the course. Right now, as we're starting out, just click on the starter project and you can see that it has a couple of things like the icon, the licenses, README, and the asset pack, right? So just go to code, download zip, and download this folder on your PC. So next, let's open up Godot. Click on Create in the project screen. Let's call this project Godot AutoBattler Course or something. Use a folder you want to use. And it doesn't really matter which renderer we use for this, but we definitely don't need advanced 3D graphics, right? So I'll be just using the compatibility renderer, just so if you want to export for web, for example, you can. And let's click on Create and Edit. Okay, so we have the fresh project. Now I can just navigate to this folder. I extracted the starter project and I can sort of just drag and drop the whole thing into the file system doc inside Godot. And sadly, we won't need icon.svg anymore because the assets include a custom icon for the project. So we can delete this by pressing delete and clicking remove. And before we jump into creating the environment, let's go to the project settings to set up some stuff first. So let's go to project settings. And first of all, we can switch up the icon for the one we included. So let's go to icon, click on this little file icon here and select icon.png by double clicking on it. Then under display and window, we can set the viewport width and height to the resolution we want to use. This is a pixel art game, so we can use a lower resolution. I use 640 by 300 for this one. And just to make sure that it's not that small when we test it, let's enable advanced settings here. And if we scroll down, we have window width override and window height override. And we can use something like 1300 by 700 for testing purposes. Then what we also need to do is to search for texture. And under rendering and textures, we can set the default texture filter from linear to nearest. So what this does, if you remember, is it turns off anti-aliasing for sprites and textures, so our pixel art sprites will look crisp. And that's enough for now, so we can close the project settings and start creating our first scene. So the arena itself, or the whole game itself, will be a 2D scene. So we can click on 2D scene, double click, and rename this to arena or something like that. And you can see that this is the resolution we will have for the game. And we can save this scene because it's unsaved. So I press Ctrl S. And we only have an assets folder for now. So I just create a new folder by clicking on this icon here, call it scenes, create a new folder inside it to stay organized. I call it arena, and arena.tscn is perfectly fine. So I can just click on save. So I was wondering why the resolution, this blue rectangle, looks a bit weird, right? I wanted a basic widescreen resolution, a 16 by 9 aspect ratio, and it's not that. So let's go back to the project settings because I messed my resolution up. So if we search for display again, go to window, and I meant to use 640 by 360, like so. And this means that the window height override is not big enough because I want it to be at least twice as big. So it's not that small when we look at it. So let's make it 750 or something. So if we close the project settings now, we should have this new line and it's much better looking. It's the typical 16:9 aspect ratio. Awesome. Let's start creating the node hierarchy now. The arena is located at 0, 0 in the top left corner, and we definitely don't want to move the whole game around, so we can click on this lock icon to make sure that we cannot move the arena itself anywhere. Then we can click on this plus sign or press Ctrl A to add a new child node, and we can search for node 2D again, because that visuals node, which will have all the icon-D, will use that node 2D as sort of a structural or organizational node. So let's double click and rename this to visuals. And under the visuals, we want to add the background first. So in Godot 4.3, tile maps were a bit reworked. So if we press Ctrl A again and search for tile map, we have two nodes now. We have tile map and tile map layer. And you can see that we have this red X next to the tile map saying that it's deprecated now. And when you can, you should use TileMapLayers instead. So that's what we'll do. We'll use a TileMapLayer node. And we can double click and rename this to background, because that's what we'll do first. And for the background to work, we have to use a tile set resource, but it's empty for now. So that's why we cannot paint anything with this tile map. So if we click on that empty tile set resource, we can create a new tile set. And you can see that it still has this tile map doc active here, which is a bit suspicious because we want to change the tile set, right? So let's not forget to switch over to tile set here and create a new tile set. Also, before dragging the image over, let's click on the tile set resource itself and change the tile size. If you remember, the name of this asset pack was 32 rogues, and that 32 suggests that the tile size of the tile sheet is 32 by 32 pixels. So now we can expand assets, and under sprites, we have a bunch of images, and we want to use tiles.png for this one. Drag and drop over this panel, and we'll have this message that the Atlas texture was modified. Would you like to automatically create the tiles? And yes, this will work because we set the tile size previously. So you need to make sure that you do this before actually dragging the image over, and it will automatically slice all the tiles. So if I press and hold the scroll wheel in my mouse, I can pan over the whole thing and see that it only highlights those tiles which actually contain some graphics. Awesome, right? So you don't have to do this by hand. Cool. So now we can start creating the background. We can actually collapse the tile set panel for now. And we can save this tile set because we want to reuse it a couple of times. So let's click on this arrow, click on save. And I think we can save this resource under the arena. And let's just call this tileset.tres for now. And you can see that we have this now. And it's much easier to reuse this, or if you want to change something with this tile set, it will be changed for all the tile map layers. So for the background, I'll just use this single tile with nothing on it. So let's go back to the tile map, select this tile, which I want to use. And you have a bunch of tools available for painting here if you haven't used the tile map system in Godot. Now I'll just use the rect tool and sort of drag and drop over the whole screen to make sure that it covers the whole resolution of the image. By the way, if you're bothered by the grid, which is automatically displayed when you select a tile map layer node, you can click on this icon here to toggle the grid visibility. I just want to make sure that the whole thing covers the resolution of the game. If you don't like that we have this extra column of tiles, you can just go to the pencil tool, the paint tool, and just right click to erase tiles. But I can't really erase these ones because you see the resolution is not a multiple of 32. So then we would have this weird artifact at the bottom. So I'll just repaint those right there. Cool. So now we have our background. And just to make sure that everything is separated to its own layer to keep things organized, we can duplicate this node by selecting it and pressing Ctrl D. And we can double click to rename this to something like props. And I want to show you a cool feature with this new tile map system that comes with Godot 4. We can select multiple tiles in this tile set. So I select a bunch of tiles, and we have this place random tile feature where we can also set a scattering value. Say something like scattering, I don't know, 0.2, and shift to the rectangle tool again. We can, on this props layer, just draw another rectangle over the background we have, and it will scatter around the props. This is way too dense for my liking, but you can play with that scatter value, right? So let's just press Ctrl Z to undo this and change the scattering value to something like 0.8, just to test out the feature. And you can see that it's still a bit too dense. This is a value between 0 and 1 you can use. So if I change it to 0.95, that's still a bit dense for my liking, but sort of randomized, and I kind of like how it looks. So then I can just go ahead, switch to the pencil tool, and erase a couple of these by pressing and holding the right mouse button, right? Now we have a couple props scattered throughout the whole arena. So let's test how this looks like, right? So let's save this with Control S, click on the play button or press F5. And we haven't configured the main scene, but this is perfect for this. Well, it's not the best, right? We expect the game to scale up and we scale the window, right? But no matter what size I use here, the game sort of remains at the top left corner of the screen, occupying only the original size in pixels. So let's change this. So close the game for now. Let's go back to project settings, and under display and window, if we scroll all the way down, we have these stretch mode options here. So for pixel art games, we want the stretch mode to set the viewport so it renders the game on the given resolution, then it scales the whole viewport up. If we hover over the stretch mode, you can read the whole documentation on this topic. Pretty straightforward stuff. For the aspect ratio, we want to keep the original aspect ratio, so we can leave it at keep. And now we have a new option called scale mode, where we can pick between fractional and integer scaling. And integer scaling is super cool for pixel art games, because then you won't be using fractions for scaling up the game. So, for example, if the screen size would be 1.5 times the original resolution, fractional scaling would scale that up, right? But then you kind of lose the 1-to-1 pixel ratio you have in your pixel art game. By making sure that we use integer scaling mode, it can only scale to integer multiples of the resolution. Again, it's explained pretty well if you hover over that property inside the editor. So if we change this, close the project settings, and run the game again, it looks much better, right? It's scaled up twice to the size it originally is. And if I click on the maximize button, you can see that because we have the title bar and the taskbar here, it cannot scale up to the resolution of my monitor, which would be an integer multiple of the original resolution. But if we were to run the game in full screen mode or borderless window mode, then it would occupy the whole screen. So pretty cool. We don't need to do this because for testing, this is perfectly fine. You can see that we have a small little black area here. It's because I haven't set the testing resolution to a multiple of the original resolution on purpose. You can see that if I resize it, because we set the aspect ratio to keep, it scales to those integer multiples. Awesome. So let's keep adding to the game. You can also see that we have something weird happening, right? Because I forgot to delete the tiles after duplicating the background layer, so it doesn't really look nice at the moment. If we hide the props, you can see that we have these different colored tiles, which I definitely didn't intend to add. So let's go back to the tile map and select those tiles and just delete them to make sure that we only leave the props in. Okay, cool. So now we have the two layers, the background layer and the props layer. Cool. So we can duplicate the props node next. And we'll have one final layer under the visuals, which is called walls. And let's not make the same mistake again. So now if we hide the props and hide the walls, you can see that the same tiles are occupied in the walls layer, right? So let's just select the whole thing and delete everything because we don't need this for the walls. I toggle the grid back on to make sure that I can see what I need to do here. And inside the tiles, let's search for that wall tile around the arena, which we'll be using. I just use this one. So let's go to paint mode and start painting the walls. So we have 4 empty tiles. Then we paint this over until we have 4 empty tiles on the other side as well. And then we need to paint the sides, which will be this tile next to it. So I click on this one to select it, paint over the first one and the last one, and do 9 tiles in total. 8, 9. The same on the other side, but if you're lazy like me, you can copy this over. So if you switch to select mode, you can select a bunch of tiles, press Ctrl C, press Ctrl V to paste it, and voila, it's much faster. And we can do the same with the bottom part of the arena. And you can see that it looks a bit weird that we have these tiles. So let's paint this over like so. And now if we turn the grid back off, it looks like this. We can enable the props again. You can see that when you switch between TileMapLayers, and opacity will be applied to all the other ones to help you sort of identify which layer you are currently editing. So we also need walls for the bench. And for that one, I use these 2 tiles up above. So for the bottom layer, which sort of barely shows, I use this tile. And for the 2 sides of the bench, I've used the other one, like so. And also, if we go back to the props layer, this is a part of the bench, so we don't really need to add props here. I can just delete this by right-clicking on it. And also, this stone won't be showing either, or this rock, because it's under a wall. Right. And that's pretty much it for the tile layers. One thing we can also do before wrapping this up is clicking on the visuals node, and we have this little icon here called group selected nodes. And what this does, if we click on it, this little icon appears here, and then you can't select the children of this node, right? So whenever I drag and drop to select something here or draw a rectangle, you see that I select the visuals node. And if I turn this off by clicking on it again, if I drag and drop over it, all of those will be selected. And we don't really want to move these tile maps around, right? So I can again just click on this one and lock the visuals itself. And now I can select anything. So I can't misclick to sort of delete or move anything, which might be really annoying when you work inside the editor. That's cool. So let's press Ctrl S to save this. Let's do the checkered board for the game area and the bench. So let's click on the arena, the root node, press Ctrl A again, and we'll add a tile map layer just like we have before. Double click and rename this to game area. For the tile set resource, we created one, right? We saved it. So we can just click on the arrow, press quick load, and look for our tile set resource file. And that's really important here. We actually want to move this game area from the top left corner of the screen. Why? Why do you think it matters where the tile set is when it comes to the checkerboard for the game area and the bench? We saw that it doesn't really matter for the other ones, right? Yes, it's in the top left corner according to its position, but I can paint with the tiles wherever I want. Let's turn on the grid for a second and think about this. If we click on the use grid snap, we can enable the grid. And if we click on the 3 dots next to it, snapping options, we can click on configure snap to use the grid system our tile set uses. So let's change the grid step from 8 pixels to 32 by 32. If we click on OK, you can see that the grid size is now according to our tile size we use. Awesome. So I want to move the game area. I go into move mode by pressing W. start dragging and dropping, and it snaps to the grid, and I want to move it here. So under transform, we can check that the position is 160 by 32. Why do you think I wanted to move it here? Well, for now, it doesn't really matter, but in the future, we actually want to use the tile coordinates to store the unit's current position inside the unit grid component, right? And if we want to map the current local mouse position to a coordinate, we have to utilize the tile set's current position. Why? Well, because if the tile set is here in the game coordinate world, then the local mouse position, when I move the mouse around here, will be 0, 0, right? Because it will be using the TileMapLayers' own local coordinate system, and this will be the origin of that, the current position. So if I move my mouse here, this will be at minus something, minus 50 pixels, and 0, because it's in the same line along the y-axis compared to this position, right? And so this is super good, because when we convert those local mouse coordinates to tile map coordinates, then when the mouse is here, this will be 0, 0. And when the mouse is here, for example, this will be 1 and 0. This will be 1 and 1. So it provides us a simple and fast way to convert mouse position into grid coordinates within our battlefield. So just by moving our tile map to this position, we made our life so much easier, because otherwise we would have to apply an offset based from the top left corner and sort of make the calculation more complex for no reason. I hope that makes sense. We'll get back to this when we actually start implementing the unit grid system and tile map highlighting in future videos. So for now, it's enough to know that we have to move this here. And when we have the correct position, we can also lock it by clicking on this lock selected nodes button to make sure that we cannot accidentally move it. Okay, so let's draw the game area as well. For this one, this checkerboard effect will be achieved by using these tiles right here with their original one color version, and we have some with some bricks laid over for some variety. So first, let's just make the checkerboard pattern, right? Let's turn off placing random tiles for now, and we can just start painting that. And we don't have to do this by hand. I just made the first one, and we can just select this, press Ctrl C, Ctrl V, and insert it a couple of times. You have to left click when you hover it over to make it final. And now, just to make it a bit more interesting, we can add some variety by using these other tiles. So kind of just randomly or intuitively or whatever you think looks nice, you can just add a couple of those. Do whatever works for you. So now we have the game area defined, but we also need two other tile map layers under this one. One is again for decoration. So we have some cool tiles with bones and blood splattered all over, and I think it adds a bit of character to the arena or the game area we have here. So with the game area selected, let's press Ctrl A, add another tile map layer, double click and rename this to something like decor. Again, we can load the tile set with quick load, and we can just add a couple of these. I think it makes it look a bit more interesting, cooler. And we also need one more tile map layer, which we won't be using now, but we'll be using later when we implement tile map highlighting. So if we click on this decor tile map layer and press Ctrl D to duplicate it, we can double click and rename this to highlight. And let's not forget that we actually need to delete those bones and blood puddles. So how this highlight layer will work when we implement the code is when we enable it and hover over a tile, we have this highlight tile right here. And so this will be painted over whatever current tile is hovered right now, right? So by itself, it does nothing, but we'll do it from code to make sure that we can hover over some tiles like so. For now, we can leave it empty. And again, we don't really want to move the decor and highlight layers around either. We want all of these layers to stay in the same spot. So we can either lock those two, but what we can do is we already locked the game area, and we can click on this grouping icon again to make sure that we cannot select its children. So now if I drag over the whole game, I cannot really select anything because basically everything is locked in its place, which is awesome. That's exactly what I wanted. The final thing we want to add is the bench, right? Because the bench needs the checker pattern as well. So let's select the root node, the arena again, press Ctrl A to add a new node, and add a new tile map layer, click on it and rename this to bench. Again, click on the arrow next to the tile set property and quick load it from our project. And for this one, I want to use alternating tiles with different colors. So we can just browse what we have here. And we have this sort of this deep red color set sort of every second one to this color. And we can use this pale purplish color to maybe between them. Yeah, but that's a bit too bright for my liking. So we have this darker purple color. Maybe it's better to use that because those colors fit better together. Yeah, something like this. And we need to add a highlight tile map layer for the bench as well, because bench tiles can be highlighted, but we don't really have to do it again. We can just sort of duplicate the highlight layer we have here by pressing Ctrl D and just drag it over the bench. Click on it and remove that too from its name, like so. And I made a mistake for the bench. Can you spot my mistake here? So can you see the position of the bench tile map layer in the game? Where is it? Well, it's at 0, 0. So we have the problem I just talked about, right? When we want to use the coordinates, then we have to offset this whole thing, right? Because on the bench, I want this tile to be at 0, 0. So we need to go into move mode by pressing W and move the bench to this point, right? You can check if this is the right place if you go into transform for the node 2D node, and you can see that the position should be at 160 and 320 respectively. So now the problem is that our bench is way off, right? So that's exactly what I meant by paying attention where your tile map layer is positioned within the game. But no worries if you made that mistake. You can just go into this select tool, go back to selection mode by pressing Q. And if we select the cells, we just add it to this bench tile map layer. We can press Ctrl X to cut it and press Ctrl V to paste it again and just click once with the left mouse button to reset the whole thing. But now you can see that the bench is actually located where it's supposed to be. So the local mouse position for the bench will be 0, 0 here. It will be something like 50 and 0 here and so on. Again, this will be super, super useful to transform the mouse position to the current coordinate within the bench or the game area. Right, so if we're done with this, we can unlock the bench as well and select these group selected nodes to make sure that we cannot really select any nodes in our screen, right? So we cannot accidentally move anything if we click like maniacs inside the editor. Awesome. We can save this with Ctrl S. And one last thing to do in this video is to add some dust particles to make the scene look a bit less static. If you like my content, please consider checking out my Ko-fi page where you can donate one time or become a member and get early access to all my content and videos. So let's select the visuals node, right? Press Ctrl A and search for particles and use a GPU particles 2D node and double click and rename this to dust particles or something like that. And we'll get an error message that we have no materials added yet. And also the particle is not at the right position. So let's go to transform and place it at the middle of the screen. And we can calculate this very easily. We don't have to use the grid snap for this. We can just divide 640 by 2 and also divide 360 by 2. Okay, so now we have the particles in the middle of the screen. And before doing anything, I want to make sure that the particles will render in front of everything. Because right now, if we use this star particle texture and drop it over the texture property, and for the process material, we can create a new particle process material. You can see that it kind of looks weird, right? It appears behind our game area, and that's because the scene tree order, right? The visuals node is before the game area and before the bench. So this will be by default rendered behind those. So what we can do, we want these dust particles to appear before anything else. So we can go to ordering and set the Z index to something bigger. You can just set it 99 or something like that to make sure that it's on top of everything in the game. Right, so now we have our particles, but it doesn't look like dust particles at all yet. So we need to tweak those settings. First of all, let's bump up the amount of particles to something like 20. We have much more star particles. And we can also set the time to something bigger because those only live for a second now and dust lingers around longer. I think it looks cooler. So we can bump this up to something like 6. And now you'll see that they live longer, but gravity affects them a bit too much. So let's click on the particle process material, and I'll make this a bit wider because it's easier to see those options. Let's go to particle flex first. Disable Z is enabled by default, so it won't rotate, and that's perfectly fine. If we go to spawn and position, we don't want the dust particles to spawn from a point, right? We want them to be sort of scattered around the whole game scene. So change the emission shape from a point to a box. And it looks the same because the box extents are just 1 pixel. So let's bump X up to 320. And this means that the dust particles can appear anywhere on the screen, right? Cool. Now we can collapse position and set the velocity. And for the velocity, I want the dust particles to spread around a bit more than 45 degrees. So I'll bump this up to 180 and set the initial velocity to something like 20 and 30 by maximum. It already looks a lot better, right? They kind of linger around. We just need to change the gravity as well. But on top of that initial velocity, we can also add some angular velocity. So let's click on animated velocity and angular velocity and change the minimum to something like 20 and the maximum to something like 40. So they rotate as well a bit. Then we can collapse both spawn and angular velocity. And you know what, animated velocity as well. And we need to go to accelerations and gravity. And you can see that we have this gravity enabled by default, but if we change that Y to 0, the dust particles look much more like dust particles. The only thing we really need to make this look better is to scale them down so they are much smaller and sort of fade them out over their lifetime. So we can collapse accelerations as well, go to display and scale. And under scale, I'll change the minimum to 0.1 and change the maximum to 0.2. You can see it already looks a lot better. And we can also add a scale curve, which will sort of change their scale over their lifetime. So let's click on new curve texture. And if we click on the curve, we can edit it, right? So let's make it look a bit more like this. So they fade out in terms of scale towards the end of their lifetime, and they fade in when they spawn. And it already looks pretty okay as a dust particle. It's just fading it out in terms of color makes it look a lot nicer too. So let's click on this curve texture to collapse it. And for this one, I won't even use like a curve for the color. I can sort of just make sure that it's not fully opaque. So if we make it semi-transparent like this, it's much less annoying to look at, right? So you have these little dust particles going on. And I think it's a nice little touch, makes this scene, this game arena instantly a bit more interesting to look at. I'm not a VFX artist by any means. I could probably spend the whole day tinkering with particles, but that's not the point of this video. I just kind of wanted to add a nice little extra touch. And when we're done with this, we can save the scene by pressing Ctrl S, and we can run the game one last time to see how it looks so far. Not too bad for a first video, huh? I kind of like it. So that's it for this video, and I guess I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.